Hey guys, Pastor Nithin here. I'm the pastor at City Alliance Church. I get to serve there as the lead pastor. I just want to say Merry Christmas, Happy Advent. I'm so excited to be here with you as we are kicking off a new series that we're calling Advent, which is really to help us prepare for the Christmas season. Now, listen, this can be a really busy and overwhelming time of year. You know, you're shopping, you're making plans, you're meal prepping, you're getting all the travel stuff in order. But really, we want to make sure that you can keep the reason for the season right in front of you, because it's easy for God's only begotten Son to become His forgotten Son. You know, when the Christmas rush comes, which is why we want to celebrate the season of Advent. Now, the word Advent isn't in the Bible, but it means coming or arriving. And this is actually the first season of the Christian calendar in church history. Another way to translate Advent is waiting. And this is what Advent is all about. It's all about waiting for the Christ child to come into our world, but also waiting for Jesus to actually come back and set the world right again. Hey, listen, can I ask you a question? Who likes waiting? If you like waiting, go ahead and say, I love waiting in the chat right now. None of us do, right? We all hate to wait, especially Americans. We hate waiting. That's why we've come up with things like 2-day Prime delivery, where we're able to click and order on Amazon and all of a sudden it shows up at our house. In fact, we expect it. Our culture is one that does not stop, right? We keep going and going and going. We have a 24-hour news cycle where we report on anything and everything, even if it's not really newsworthy. We hate to stand still. We hate lines. We're constantly checking our phones if we have to wait, or we start to feel irritated because we feel like our time's not being used well. And the reality is we know that time is precious, and it can feel like waiting is actually oppressive. Like my favorite theologian and philosopher Tom Petty said, the waiting is the hardest part. Every day you see one more card, and you take it on faith, you take it to the heart. The waiting is the hardest part. I'll stop singing right now. For those of you 40 and under, you're going to get that. If not, just Google it. You know, I asked Carl, who's actually our worship leader here at City Alliance, if we could actually do that for Advent, and he just looked at me, shook his head, and walked away. But I got to ask you a question. What are you waiting for? What is something or someone that you're waiting for during this Advent season? Or maybe you've been waiting longer. It's been months or even years. Maybe you're waiting for the dream job, that dream career that you would always hope would come your way. Or you're just waiting for the pandemic to finally be over. No more masks, social distancing, everything's open. Some of you are like, Nithin, I'm just waiting for my kids to fall asleep so I can go to bed at night. Or maybe you're waiting for a coworker to quit or a deal to come through. Some of you, you're waiting for a spouse or a husband or a wife, or you're waiting for a child, or maybe you're waiting for that health condition to finally be healed. I've talked with some of you that are waiting for your adult kids to come back to Jesus, or maybe you're just waiting for God to bring you out of this season of trial and struggle and pain, and it seems like you've been in there for way too long. It's been a season of grief or loss because you've lost someone close to you, or maybe you're waiting for the depression to go away, the anxiety to leave. Advent reminds us that we're waiting for Jesus to come and restore and rescue creation, to reunite us with the Father, to bring us home. And that's what we're doing. We're waiting. Advent reminds us that our timetable may not be God's timetable. While we're waiting, the season of Advent challenges us how we view time. As rugged, individualistic, Central PA Americans, we view time as linear, constantly going, like a clock. Think about that. Time-bound, time-oriented. And we kind of base everything according to our time frame and timetable. Like, okay, we're going to graduate high school and then go to college. At 21, I'm going to go to graduate school and build my career from there. I'm going to then, in my late 20s, I'm going to get a corner office, really start climbing the social ladder that way. I'm going to get married. Once that's done, I'm going to have kids in my 30s. And then once that's done, I think I'm going to retire in my 60s and travel and play golf and see the world. See, we have a timetable based on our priorities, based on the clock. We only have a limited amount of time, and it's slowly, bit by bit, ticking away. And it's funny. It's funny that we think that we can actually control time. It's funny that we think we can actually control what happens. Oh, Jordan, there we go. You graduate, but then you can't afford to go to college. You drop out of grad school, or you get put on a performance improvement plan, or you lose your dream job, your marriage falls apart, and you're struggling with infertility, the economy crashes, and so does your 401k, and you're pushing retirement back further and further. And the entire time, the clock keeps ticking. It doesn't stop. Advent reminds us that we don't follow a clock, we follow a compass. God says you need to follow the compass. I'm in charge of the clock. See, the clock is all about dates, but the compass is about direction. We can't control the clock, but we can control where we go and what direction we take today. Last week we lit the hope candle and talked about how we can actually move in the direction of hope through our Christmas offering, that we can actually offer hope by prayerfully giving and offering above and beyond out of gratitude to help families waiting to adopt and update our facility, which we've been waiting for a while. Today, I want to open up our compass and see how we can move into the next direction, which is peace. Go ahead and type peace in the chat right now. Today, we're lighting the peace candle. And one of the names of Jesus is actually Prince of Peace, and he promises to bring peace to the world. We live in a world that's marked with conflict, violence, and destruction. Can we ask an honest question? How is Jesus doing bringing peace? Perhaps we wonder, can Christianity actually bring peace to the world or just more conflict? You watch the news and you see things like another school shooting out in Michigan, a racism and injustice that seems to be festering in our world. We're more politically divided than ever before. We put people into categories, we divide them up, we pit them against one another, and the conflict may not be violent, but maybe it gets violent on social media between toxic family members and conversations that lead to hurt feelings and even more people literally cutting each other off. Is this the peace on earth that Jesus came to bring? See, this is why we need the compass of Advent. Advent redirects us to the mission of Jesus. Jesus saw the brokenness in our world, the conflict, the division, and he stepped into our reality. He stepped into that conflict. He actually reconciled us to God, meaning he made peace between sinful humanity and a holy, righteous God. But here's the beauty of this. Jesus brings peace to you and through you. Jesus lived a radical life and was a radical rabbi. And what we'll soon see is that Jesus came into the world, this world of violence and terror. And in this world, he said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." See, this is from one of Jesus' most famous sermons. It's what I'd call his GOAT sermon, right? Greatest of all time, the Sermon on the Mount. He basically says that my kids who follow Jesus, who have experienced a transformation of the heart by my love, will actively be making peace in my name in this broken world. This is how I bring peace to the world. I will bring peace with God to you, and you will bring peace to others. Where God will actually use us to bring peace to our families, peace to our schools, peace to our neighborhoods, and even our city. But how do we do this? How can this become practical in our day-to-day lives? Well, Jesus actually shows us how to do this in Matthew 5, verses 38 to 41, part of his Sermon on the Mount. Now, Matthew is one of Jesus' biographers, and he's a brilliant writer. And when he writes, "Blessed are the peacemakers," it's actually like a hyperlink, a link that you click on a website and then opens up another website elsewhere. That's exactly what's happening here. And so Matthew links the peacemaker verse with Matthew 5, 38 to 41, where Jesus is about to teach us something radical and countercultural. See, moving his people into a new compass direction on peace. But Jesus begins his teaching in a way that most first century rabbis do. He says, "You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth." Now, I want you to imagine that Jesus is standing on a mountain, maybe sitting somewhere like this, and thousands of people all around him are listening. And then they hear him say, "Eye for an eye, tooth for tooth." And the people are like, "Yeah!" They're losing their minds, like, "Yeah, Jesus!" I want you to imagine a Penn State whiteout game. They're like yelling, they're going crazy. They're like, "Yeah, Jesus, kill our enemies." Now, I think it's easy for us to kind of hear that, and we kind of look down on them. And we can think, oh, what a bunch of ignorant first century Jewish people. But remember, they knew the Bible better than you did. They knew that Jesus was talking about Leviticus 24, where it says, "Anyone who injures their neighbor or is to be injured in the same manner, fracture for fracture, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth." This rabbi knows what he's talking about. He's actually quoting, my favorite passage. That's probably what a lot of them are thinking, which is really what's known as the law of retaliation. You see, the law of retaliation worked in the first century the way that it kind of works actually in Williamsport today. Someone hurts us, we hurt them back. Someone holds views or policies politically that we view as dangerous, well, we attack them and they attack us, and it goes back and forth. So while we could look down on the first century, we still do the exact same thing that they have. Eye for an eye justice, the law of retaliation. It still rules our world. Or it gets even personal, like maybe your mom or your dad makes an offhanded comment about how you should raise your kids. Now she's the enemy. And you make a backhanded comment back and you say, well, look at the way you raised me, Mom. Look at how I turned out, Dad. Or the person on the road cuts you off and you honk at them and they give you the one-finger salute. We used to call that the New Jersey greeting when I lived in Jersey. Or your boss tells you off in front of your direct reports and you fire back by talking down about him in front of his boss. See, the problem with the law of retaliation, it's never enough. It never satisfies. We want more. We don't just want to see a bully put in their place. We want to see their entire life ruined and wrecked. We don't just want to see the politician we disagree with compromised. We want to see their lives crash and burn. The law of retaliation escalates more and more and more until it gets out of control. Eye for an eye justice. And this is what was happening in the first century. See, to understand how radical Jesus' sermon was, you need to understand the history of what was happening in the first century. It was a powder keg about to explode into retaliatory violence. And to understand this, we actually need to know the history of what I call the Romans versus the rebels. Go ahead and type that in right now if you're watching. Romans versus rebels. You see, Caesar, the guy who invented the salad, is trying to crush any and all resistance to Roman rule. See, Rome had conquered Israel, and they were all creating these mass inequalities to the people. Leaders like King Herod, the king who tried to kill Jesus, maybe you remember him, were working with the Romans to intimidate the poor and the powerless. Herod's massive taxes on the people were crushing and fueling anger and fueling all sorts of resentment. That's why they were eager for eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth justice. This eventually led to a massive rebellion that took place in AD 66, led by a sect of Jews called the Zealots, the most famous of which, you might have heard his name, Judas Iscariot. And they had no problem using death and violence. They had no issue with slitting throats for Rome if it meant they got what they wanted. Merry Christmas, by the way. This is the world that the radical Rabbi Jesus walked into, a world where the people were looking for a warrior Messiah to push the Romans out of Palestine. So when they heard Jesus start his message by saying, you've heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, they're like, yes! Jesus, we're ready for you. We're ready to start a riot. We're ready for a fight. They were ready. Jesus, you just say the word or we're going to light up this powder keg and watch Rome burn. But then, Rabbi Jesus finishes his sentence and he says this, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. Wait, what? Yeah, and also, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. See, the people all of a sudden did not know what to do with Jesus because, they live in this world just like we do, where we're taught to retaliate and then some. And Jesus is saying that the eye for an eye model of justice is obsolete. Jesus knew that eye for an eye justice would just make the world blind. And it would never end. You take my eye, I take your eye. You take my eye, I take your leg. And on it goes. And at some point, someone has to take a stand and stop the cycle. Instead, he's calling for a higher standard, which was to resist retaliation. Because remember what Jesus said. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Not blessed are the warmongers, but the peacemakers. When we first look at this, it seems that Jesus is teaching us to be passive, to simply be a doormat, let people walk all over you. But that is not what is happening here. This is the complete opposite of this radical teaching of Jesus. Jesus is actually teaching us to lean into conflict and not walk away. It's what some scholars call active nonviolence. Anybody here have an enemy? Maybe someone who looks down to you, someone you'd love to maybe get revenge against, or maybe someone who, when they succeed in your heart, you're like, yes, they're going down. We all have an enemy. But let's break this down. Jesus, our radical rabbi, gives us 3 pictures of what it means to move in the direction of peace, to follow the compass, and trust God that he's going to set things right in his timetable. He starts by this radical teaching called turn the other cheek, or, as Jesus says, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Now, this is probably really hard to understand, so I actually want to demonstrate how this works, but I need to find someone to slap. Let me think. Hey, I have a friend of mine here. This is my friend Jordan. Well, listen, in the ancient world, if you wanted to slap someone on the right cheek, with your right hand, it'd be kind of hard if you tried to do it with your left because, one, I'm not a lefty, and lefties were kind of looked down upon in the ancient world. You'd always use your right hand. And so if I wanted to use my right hand, I would have to use the back of my hand. So what I would do is I'd come up to you and smack you like this. Maybe you've heard the term a backhanded compliment. That's where we get it from, just getting hit by the back of the hand. Now, Romans would hit people with the back of their hands that they viewed as inferior. So if you were a Jew or if you were a slave, you'd always get hit with the back of someone's hand because that's how they showed that you were worthless, that you had no value in Roman culture. So when Jesus says, when someone slaps you, turn the other cheek, it's like, I'm going to give you my backhand to show you that you're worthless. But then when you show the other cheek, what you're saying is, no, that's not true. I have dignity. I'm worth respect. So treat me like a fellow equal human being. Hit me like a man. Hit me like I'm a person. So what Jesus was doing is actually turning the tables on the oppressed and the oppressor. So now the person who's being oppressed now has the power and has a voice because they're able to express their dignity and worth. Jordan, thank you so much, man. That was awesome. Appreciate that. Well, listen, guys, I just want to make sure that I make a clarification here. Jesus is not advocating that you be a doormat and let people just beat you up, that you just take abuse. In fact, if you're being abused, or your kids are, you turn the other cheek by actually calling the cops and putting them in handcuffs because you're communicating, I'm a person worth dignity and respect. See, Jesus isn't stripping any power from anyone, but he's actually restoring power and restoring their voice and amplifying it. Do you see how radical this teaching was? Jesus, this radical rabbi, to the zealots who wanted to slit Roman throats, it's not eye for an eye, but it's turn the other cheek. You see, it's letting people see your humanity and your dignity. And his audience was shocked. And he doesn't just stop there. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. So he moves from a physical altercation, a conflict, to a legal conflict. Do you ever had a frustrating lawsuit that you've been a part of? See, at the time, people only owned 2 pieces of clothing. The rich would often try to steal people's stuff through lawsuits, including shirts. You could actually lose a shirt, but not a coat, because a coat was essential. In fact, it was actually against the law for them to take a coat. So if you gave them your coat, you were standing there butt naked and vulnerable. That very act, you're actually naming and shaming the evil that was being done. So really, Jesus is showing we need to show vulnerability over violence. Imagine reading through this passage while struggling with a difficult boss or a roommate. And so instead of being passive-aggressive or saying nothing, what if you admitted that their behavior hurt you? It's confused you or even demotivated you. And you actually open up your heart and you were honest. And listen, you may get hurt. They may attack you or get defensive. But then you actually be able to be honest and really share what you were struggling with. Don't you think God would honor that? That God would protect you, change that person's heart, and bring peace, maybe even peace that you may not even see. Where God's timing comes together. But as you move in this new direction, this compass of peace, God's going to bring his perfect timing into it. The third picture that Jesus gives us is where he gives this final instruction to God's people. He says, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. So in the Roman world, Romans would grab Jewish people off the streets and force them to walk with their packs on their backs for at least 1 mile. The Jews had to do this. Imagine minding your own business, you're playing with your kids in your yard, you're running your business, and all of a sudden a Roman centurion grabs you from the front yard, uncompensated, by the way, and makes you take their pack. But Rabbi Jesus said, don't just go 1 mile, go 2. Because 2 things would happen. You would die to yourself, but not only that, you'd also shame your oppressor. Maybe even make them curious. Like, why are you doing this for me? Well, because I follow a radical rabbi named Jesus who wants me to show love to you. See, Jesus is showing the people how to creatively confront evil power rather than just retaliate. Because retaliation is not the same as confrontation. As Christ followers, we are called to confront evil. When we read this portion of the Sermon on the Mount, this wasn't a manifesto for passivity. Rather, this was a call to active nonviolence, a call to confrontation. But I know what some of you are thinking. Will that even change anything? What difference, Nithin, could the Sermon on the Mount actually make? It's very similar to what was going on in the American South in the 30s. with Jim Crow laws that were designed to keep African Americans marginalized, powerless, and in poverty. Southern politicians used their power and privilege to actually terrorize and marginalize African Americans and other minorities. And God raised up men and women in a movement that was actually birthed from Jesus' greatest sermon ever. Men like Martin Luther King and women like Rosa Parks who confronted evil through nonviolent resistance. Let me show you a picture of active nonviolent resistance from the civil rights marches. This is when Dr. King and his followers went into Alabama and had to face down the brutality of the police who were using fire hoses, police dogs, to stop them. But they kept moving forward. They didn't stop. They said, we're not going to stop until every man, woman, and child are treated with dignity and respect and as equals in the eyes of the law and society. So I know some of you are thinking, well, Nithin, that's a nice thought. Super idealistic. And I mean, the civil rights is one thing, but I can't do this on a daily basis. But let me ask you this. What would going the extra mile look like for you? Who's the person that you can bless by doing good to them, even if they don't do good for you? Whether it's a bad boss or a conniving coworker. Maybe you have a critical conversation with a spouse and they're super critical about what you're saying, what you're doing, and it feels like that happens all the time, and it escalates into a huge fight because of an eye for an eye mentality. But rather, what if you stopped and didn't retaliate and said, you know what you said really hurt me, but I love you. I'm not going to shut down. I'm not going to go anywhere. And I know I've hurt you as well. Let's talk this through. Or maybe you're scrolling in your phone through Facebook and Instagram and you see a friend post something. It's a little racist. You're kind of offended by it. And rather than comment in anger or hit the unfollow button or the hide button, what if you actually picked up a phone and called them and said, hey, listen, I just saw what you posted. I'd love to learn a little bit more about where you're coming from because it's very different from how I think. Would you mind meeting for coffee or lunch? And you actually use that as a moment to build bridges with people rather than put up walls. Jesus was a radical rabbi who practiced what he preached. When Jewish leaders and the Roman government caught wind of Jesus' radical message, they killed him. They crucified him on a Roman cross, which was actually the way that the Romans executed political enemies. It was their way of humiliating and dehumanizing them. And there Jesus was, naked and vulnerable. He could have responded with violence. He could have said, well, to hell with all of you, and brought down angel armies to defeat and destroy all of them. But instead, Jesus prayed for his enemies. And when they came to taunt him, he said, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Jesus literally laid down his life for his enemies. He is the perfect example of confrontation without retaliation. He faced down the evil of sin and death, which had tried to destroy him, but instead the forces of darkness were dismantled. The way of the cross, the way of sacrifice and serving, triumphed over hate and darkness. That's how he brought peace. Who do you need to lay down your life for? Who is that enemy that you need to show the reckless love of God to? If you say to me, Nithin, I could never forgive what my ex-husband did. I could never forgive what my roommate did. I could never forgive what my old boss did. And I just have to say that you're right, you can't. But Jesus can. In fact, he did it by forgiving you. The Bible says that we were once enemies of God. But when we put our trust in Jesus and invite him to live in our lives, we actually find hope and find healing and find forgiveness and have the ability to forgive, to turn the other cheek, to go the extra mile. So if you're here watching this right now and you're like, where do I get that kind of power? I would love to actually lead you in a prayer where you can actually give your life to Jesus, because you can only do it by the power of God. So if you're watching this right now and maybe you don't have a relationship with Christ, or maybe you need to remember what the gospel is about, would you go ahead and pray this prayer with me? I'm just going to pray this, and I just want to invite you to pray it with me. Lord Jesus, I confess that I struggle with forgiving enemies. God, I confess that I see them as difficult people that I just want to get even with. But Jesus, would you help me forgive them? By your power, I ask that you forgive them, but first, would you forgive me? Would you forgive the ways I've been an enemy to you, where I've alienated you, where I've contradicted your word or your ways? And God, I want to commit to following you. I want to have this enemy kind of love that can only come from the deepest forgiveness and healing that comes from the cross. Father, would you come, make me new, make me fresh, so that I can also offer peace. Thank you, God, for peace with you, so that I can actually bring peace to others. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, listen, if you prayed that with me, I just want to invite you to let us know who you are. You can go on our website, you can send us an email, and we can help you take your next steps to grow as a follower of Jesus. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great Christmas. Have a great Advent. God bless. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching today's message. I hope it spoke to you and it inspired you. Go ahead and hit the subscribe button. That way you can stay up to date in all of our latest messages here at City Alliance Church. And if you want to partner with us to take the gospel here, there, and everywhere, go ahead and hit the give button. Your faithful tithes and offerings help us reach more people with the good news of Jesus Christ.